All right, we might get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this virtual seminar talking about climate change in a pandemic. Wherever you are, I hope you're safe and well. I acknowledge the elders, both past and present, of the Wurundjeri people who are the custodians of the land that I'm on today. And I also pay respect to the traditional owners of the lands where you are and on where the university campuses are actually situated. I'm Liz Foley. I'm the project officer for the Climate Reality Project at the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. The wonderful expert you're about to hear from today, Dr. Rebecca Huntley, is no stranger to climate reality and MSSI. She's both a trained climate reality leader and she also delivered the 2019 MSSI oration on renewing democracy in a time of environmental crisis. Rebecca Huntley is one of Australia's most experienced social researchers and former director of the Mind and Mood Report, the longest running measure of Australia's attitudes and trends. She writes and presents for the ABC, has a background in publishing, academia and politics, and holds degrees in law, film studies and a PhD in gender studies. Rebecca's love and concern for her 3 young girls and seeing school strikers demanding adults to urgently act on climate inspired Rebecca herself to take climate action. Today, she'll discuss the main themes of her recent book, How to Talk About Climate Change in a Way That Makes a Difference, and extend those themes to the challenges we're all facing in the midst of a global pandemic. She'll present for approximately 30 minutes, and you're welcome to submit questions via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We may not be able to respond to all questions at the end of the presentation, but we will do our best. So on that note, please join me in welcoming Dr. Rebecca Huntley.
Liz, thanks so much. I'm calling in from Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, and I pay respects to elders past and present and any Indigenous people on the call today. I'm going to try not to get distracted by this, by what's happening in America and occasionally blocking the climate deniers that are occasionally on my feed, but I'm going to really focus on everybody. So before I talk, I want to really thank both the MSSI and Climate Reality for putting on and asking me to be involved in really critical events. So both the Climate Reality training in Brisbane and also having the opportunity to live the oration, which really helped me focus and develop my thinking and advocacy in this area. Their work is excellent. I'm so glad to be presenting to you today. I'm not going to focus too much on my book. The book has been out for 6 months. Happy to talk about it for anybody who's read it. Happy for anybody to buy it. And more importantly, given it's a pandemic and it's quite hard, and if people's libraries are open, I'm just as happy for you to ask for the library to buy it, because every time you borrow the book from the library, I get a little bit of money. It's much more important to me that this book gets read and shared and talked about, even in really critical ways by people who engage with the climate movement, then I make a lot of money from a book about climate change, which is really not something that ever happens. Today, what I really want to do is share with you, and I'll ask, I've got a very, very short PowerPoint presentation, I promise not to bore you, which I'll get to be shared right now. The thing I really want to share with you today is something for anybody who either has read the book or saw my MSSI oration. A really new piece of research that I've been involved in, luckily to be involved in and will be for the next 3 to 5 years, which is an Australian version of the 6 Americas study. So for those of you who don't know, Yale University has been producing a large-scale measurement of American attitudes and behaviours on climate. When I realised that I wanted to really focus my work in this area, when I went to Climate Reality, right after I went to the Climate Reality training, I went to Yale to meet people that run this project. And it was really clear to me that it was something that was going to be really important, and an Australian equivalent of this, to be able to help advocacy and communication in the area of climate. What it really does is it defines audiences based on attitudes and behaviours around climate very clearly, and provides a kind of focus for us all to think about how can we effectively argue for a transition to a low emissions economy with these different audiences. And embedded in this is an understanding that climate change is not just a question now, and hasn't been for a while, of just what the facts are and what the policy setting should be, but is a deeply political, emotional worldview response, and that we have to understand those emotions, politics and worldview as we attempt to convince the vast majority of people that this transition is happening and that we need to steer it in the right direction and do it in a timely manner so we can create a livable world. So here you've got what I'm going to talk about, because I'm going to talk a little bit about what's been happening to Australian attitudes to climate change during the pandemic. And there's the cover of my book. And like I said, not going to really talk about it much today, but feel free to borrow it. There's lots of podcasts online now of me talking about it as well if you're not a reader. A bit about the segmentation, a bit about COVID, and this is mainly to make you realise that just because we're in a pandemic doesn't mean people aren't prepared to think and talk about climate change. I'll talk more about that. And some just little tips about how we break the climate silence. And again, that's a little bit from my book, but we'll race through that, and hopefully, Liz, I might get you to do something dramatic to capture my attention to make sure that I stay in the time allocated. Wave at 25 minutes. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is for those of you who were at the oration or are aware of the segmentation. This is a very easy, straightforward, cartoonish representation of what the Yale segmentation is, which is basically that American voters who are at the polls right now, do the right thing, break pretty neatly into 6 groups on climate. So everything from the alarmed, which I kind of assume is all of us, so people who are really anxious about climate change, vote and make consumer decisions and do a whole lot of advocacy and public advocacy, private advocacy around climate change, because we're really, really concerned. The alarmed not only accept the climate science, they accept that climate change is affecting us today and will affect them personally. Importantly, they believe that things can be done. Their primary emotional response to climate change at the moment, other than fear and anger, is mainly frustration. They're frustrated at the pace of change. They want it to be faster. Then you've got concerned, which has always been one of the biggest segments. So these are people that are worried, but they're not necessarily highly active, and they don't always vote about climate change with climate change in mind. Then you've got the cautious, who are exactly that, believe the climate science, but just don't want the transition to happen quickly because they're quite anxious about the economic and social consequences, and they're not necessarily confident that we can make that transition without making sure that it's not really, really expensive for consumers, or that we're not going to have energy security. Disengaged, exactly that, not really thinking about it, really immersed in their own lives. Doubtful, so these are people who aren't deniers. Sometimes I call them low-fat deniers or deniers light. But the difference between doubtful and dismissive is another word for deniers, is that doubtful people aren't completely closed-minded. Like, you can reach them, and there are people who still broadly respect institutions. And more significantly, the difference between doubtful and dismissive is that doubtful people are prepared to do a whole lot of things that we would describe as climate action, not necessarily because of the climate, but that they see the value in it. And that's actually true of other segments, but particularly of them. So doubtful people would be far more open to things like installing renewable energy in their home, eating less meat, driving less, all those other kinds of things. Dismissives are exactly that, deniers. They're just dismissive of the whole issue. He could easily be caressing a lump of coal there, but he's embracing a petrol tank. It's important to know that dismissives in any segmentation that's been done around the world, whether that be in the US, whether that be in Europe, whether that be in India or Australia prior to the Climate Compass, which I'm about to share with you, because a version of this has been done in academia previously. Some people would know Don Hine did something called 5 Australias. It's a kind of similar version of this. Dismissives have always been in the kind of 10% single-digit mark throughout this debate. So they're a very small percentage of the population. They're a vocal part of some of our more powerful institutions. But pretty much 90% of the population sits on a continuum that mostly accepts the science, right, and is not completely closed-minded on this issue. So we've got those numbers in our corner. Next thing. This is where the segmentation falls at the moment in America. Yale, which I'm constantly in contact with them, will be doing this again after the American election, because they're doing a whole lot of other stuff. And you can see here some pretty broad correlations here with how things sit in Australia. America and Australia don't have enormous amounts in common, but how we break down in relation to climate change just happens to be one of them. So next one, can't really see this very well, apologise, haven't come very well. Let me introduce you to Climate Compass. A couple of things you should know about this is you kind of peruse these numbers and look at these emojis. You can see that there's 7 segments, and I'll explain why in a minute. The exciting thing about this, there's so much that's exciting to me about this, because I left Yale, I left Yale 18 months ago thinking that we needed a segmentation that was up to date, usable, and focused on how we message, how we direct messages and audiences to really accelerate advocacy, whatever that is, and that this would be a really useful tool for any organisation, whether it's focused on climate, who wants to do something on climate, who wants a more sophisticated approach to audiences, and that a really important tool in the hands of advocates, and a kind of like a baseline for everybody to refer to, and that would be something that they could access reasonably easily. Important too for smaller organisations that don't have the money to do these kinds of segmentations. Segmentations like this are very expensive. Big corporations can do them. I guarantee you the fossil fuel industry has done a version of this, and that hasn't been made available to us, but this is available. The other thing you should know is that we did the field work during COVID, and we actually did some questions as part of it in relation to how people felt about COVID. At the time that was happening, I was also doing quite a lot of qual research, which I'll talk about in a minute, which shows that, while people were obviously concerned, that kind of this high level concern about in some audiences around climate that came out of the bushfires dropped off a bit, but it didn't mean that people didn't think, look, this transition to renewable energy is important, we support it, in some ways it's inevitable. If it can be part of an economic recovery, we should support it. And both the qual and the quant shows that Australians, by and large, are able to walk and chew gum at the same time. They realise that COVID and recovery from COVID is important, that it will take some time, but that there are other issues of national importance that should also be, considered by our leaders and the rest of us at the same time. So, it's too simplistic to say, because of the economic problems and we're having, and of the pandemic, people can't think about climate change or can't think about renewable energy. That's not correct. So here are these 7 segments. I haven't got much more to add than I did when I was talking about the Yale segments, because the mindset is quite similar. But you can see too that dismissive group, again, in the single digits, but you can see that doubtful group is 16%, quite a significant percentage. If you combine these two together, that's not to be dismissed in any way. I can talk a bit about the disengaged. They're really very interesting segment. But what I want you to pay attention, the new segment that we found was called Alert. So one of the things we did with this segmentation that we wanted to build on in terms of the previous one, so we wanted to think about how can we extend this and learn the lessons from the other ones and make it better, is we really wanted to focus on not just attitudes, not just mindset, messengers, approaches to issues around renewable energy or the rest of it, bushfires. We wanted to get a real sense of what were people doing now. Yes, it was self-reported, but what were people doing now in terms of a list of advocacy behaviour? Everything from, solar panels in their home to voting, joining a party because of climate change. So the real spectrum, it's about 36 different advocacy behaviours. We wanted to get a sense of what people were doing now and what they felt open to learning about, like what they thought they would be open to doing in the future. Again, speculative, but important as a starting point to think, okay, I'll give you an example. In the alarmed group, which is a group that's getting bigger, so the people who are going from the concerned group, so we're seeing that concerned group in the 30%, slowly shifting and diminishing and moving to the alarmed. In that alarmed group, about a third of them wouldn't be doing much advocacy, certainly not public advocacy. I see them as kind of silently freaking out at home. Maybe they're not talking about it with friends. Maybe they feel like, well, what can I actually do? They might be voting on climate change, but they don't know what else to do. When we put all those lists of advocacy behaviour in front of them, there were some things they were much more open to do than doing others. So for part of that, for anybody looking at that segment, is thinking, well, how can we increase the knowledge, understanding, confidence and opportunity for those people already alarmed about climate change to do things, whether it be talking to their superannuation fund or talking to their financial institution or being involved in a local advocacy group around renewable energy, getting them to switch power. What can we do, to activate them? And there were, in a sense, even amongst the alert and concerned, so if you combine the alert, concerned and alarmed, that's a big chunk of the Australian population. But not all of them are active. So it's a real opportunity for the movement to think about how to talk to that group and where the opportunities are to get them to be active. But to go back to this new segment, so one of the things, like I said, we wanted to do with the segmentation is really focus on opportunities for future advocacy. And when we did that, so opportunities for future advocacy also depends on whether people think future advocacy will be effective. So do they, and that's another way of saying that is, do they think we've got the time to do anything about this? So we came up, because we asked those questions, because that was a kind of a sharper, a whole lot of sharp questions that sharpened the segmentation, this new group emerged. In a sense, it's a subgroup of the alarmed. They're really alarmed about climate change. They absolutely accept the science. They accept the worst case scenario, but unlike the alarmed, concerned or cautious, they're a bit worried that we've missed the boat. So when you ask them questions about, do we have the time to kind of really create an effective livable world, they're far more pessimistic. That being said, they still think that advocacy behaviour is good. They're not down on it. They're just really quite pessimistic about the outlook. Unsurprisingly, even though we're a small section, they do tend to skew to younger people. Now, these aren't doomers. If anybody doesn't know what a doomer is, maybe somebody in the chat can give them a definition. They're not even people who've been involved in the environment movement for a long time and are burnt out. And I think for a lot of people on the line now, there would be people who have been involved in climate stuff for a while, and you have those long dark nights of the soul at 2 a.m. where you think, I better start stocking up on canned goods and learn how to hunt feral rabbits so that I can defend myself when civilization collapses. And we all have those moments, but this is a slightly different group. I would hate to see that group enlarge. I would hate to see any group that thinks that we can't solve at least some of these problems in the time we have allocated enlarge, but I think there are still a group that can remain active. Anyway, so let's move on to the next. How are we going for time, Liz? All I can see is I can't see your actual face. I can just see a smiling face. Do you want to say something?
We're about halfway, Rebecca.
Oh, good. Excellent. I know that people are going to have lots of questions about these segments. Here's a little bit more about them, and I'll leave that on the screen so people can read. What you've got is the percentages, but then you've actually got the real numbers. So sometimes when you look at 4%, that's not a lot, or 9%, but there are numbers. And of course, how they're allocated across electorates or how they're allocated in communities can make a difference. At the moment, while you look through these, and I would just say two things. While there tends to be a demographic skew in each of these segments. So, for example, people who are alarmed are more likely to, are on average more educated than the average Australian. And people in the alarmed group are more likely, for example, to have gone to university or done a postgraduate degree than people who are either disengaged or doubtful. I don't want that to lead people down the track that people who are alarmed are smarter than these other groups, because it's always a problem. to assume that going to university means you're clever, and the risk of being controversial, I would say that most of the front bench of the current government has gone to university. So it's not really about university. I think what it is about what a university degree does for you is it makes you understand a bit more about the generally rigorous process you have to go through in order to be an expert. So when so I don't know much about climate science. I know I got a big and interesting dose of it at Climate Reality. I read some of it. And in fact, I didn't do science at school. But when somebody with a PhD or as a professor at a kind of, a really, really established university tells me that this is happening, because I've done a PhD and I understand how universities work, I know that he probably isn't making it up. And if 99% of all his colleagues are also telling me this is happening and I'm believing it. So generally, I think what happens so you've got an over-indexation of educated people in alarmed, alert and concerned, more than doubtful, and more than disengaged. So there are skews in each of these groups, a little bit of skews in some of them in relation to gender, location. You can imagine, you're alarmed, you're much more likely to be educated, living in the inner city, progressive politics. And so all of those kinds of things that we already know. That doesn't mean that there aren't people, I don't want people to personify these groups so much, which is why we didn't use kind of, the faces of people. We used emojis as a kind of let's say, gender neutral. So think about this more as a kind of, we don't want you to kind of think, oh, doubtful or dismissive people are cranky old white men and alarmed people, inner city, progressive women. While there's a lot of both of those characters in each of those groups, I don't want people to think that. The other thing I want people, the one category I would say, and I'd love to come back at least every year to present aspects of this research, because we're going to be doing some ongoing qual and quant research off the base of this and updating the segmentation every year. The one group I want you to look at here is the cautious. Again, not as big as the alarmed and the concerned, but significant, I think, almost, and there's a reason why they're in the middle. An interesting group because they're almost like a bridge, right? So they're like alarmed, alert and concerned, and you don't really have to, they're not totally disengaged from the issue of climate, and they believe the science. Their biggest concern, and nearly 1 in 5 Australians, is how quickly we should make the transition to renewable energy. They're quite, like I said previously, economically and socially anxious. When words like transition, when you talk about transition or disruption for this group, they freak out. When you cut this data by who voted for what party in the last election, unsurprisingly, this group stand out in front of all of them in terms of having voted for the previous government, voting for the government in the previous election. Not because they don't believe in climate change, but because they're worried about the pace of change, economic change. They're enthusiastic about renewables, but of all the groups, when I'm doing focus groups, all the groups, they're the ones that just really goes, are renewables ready? And they just, can we do it? And what about the jobs? They overestimate. I mean, a lot of people overestimate the extent to which fossil fuel companies, deliver prosperity to Australians and employ people. But continuously this group say, oh, we can't possibly make the transition quickly because it'd be really bad for the economy, blah, blah, blah. These are people who already believe in climate change, want government to do things, believe that renewable energy is important. Don't think, the future is nuclear. I have a feeling that if we can convince this group, if we can get this group of cautious people down from 1 in 5 to 1 in 7, 8, then we will have nailed this, because a lot of these people, very equally vote Labor, Liberal, relatively easily distribute, kind of like, they're almost like they're right in the middle. So I'm constantly thinking about how to encourage confidence, optimism, and a sense of urgency amongst the cautious. Perhaps not urgency around acting on emissions, but urgency about capitalising on the extraordinary opportunities that renewable energy offers Australia. And it was really at Climate Reality, watching the exuberant and almost kind of still boyishly youthful, even though he's losing a bit of his hair, Al Gore talk about how lucky we are in this country to have all these natural resources, to have had this kind of incredible history in renewable energy technology and the opportunity for us there. And it was really out of his mouth that I first heard the phrase renewable energy powerhouse. And as an American, to be so almost envious of what we have here and what we could do, made me realise that this appeal to the cautious, and I've tested that in numerous focus groups, is a really, really good way to go. And we're getting there. You know, you're starting to hear that language out of the mouths of, you know, so many people in the business community and the advocacy community, even from the Australian Labor Party, but we need to do better. So I'm very, very focused on this 18%. In so many ways in terms of this important program of how we persuade and how we shift and how we move in the time that we have, particularly at an electoral level, but also throughout civil society. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. Okay, just quickly. So as part of the segmentation work, 55.5, which is the agency that we used, has never ever done any political work, by the way, ever again. Before, they do a lot of work for big companies. Also did some work about COVID and climate. Yes, the bushfire season, fuel concern about climate change. But interestingly, COVID-19 made 47% of Australians more concerned about climate change. So it really kept the focus of, let's say, the concerned and alarmed and on that climate change is actually, an important thing that we need to actually do more about this crisis to deal with the other. So there's a bit of quant for you, a little bit of qual that I did. So I did a lot of qualitative research over the last 6 months, not surprisingly, on climate and COVID. Most of it in suburban Sydney and Melbourne, most of it in Queensland because everybody's focused on Queensland. We tested a particular campaign that was done as part of the lead up to the Queensland election to argue that investment in renewables was going to be critical to this, a renewing of our economy, right? And a kind of restoring and renewing of our economy. Tested lots of images. This was the most popular one. This kind of, fabulous young female footy player saying, we've been powering the footy lights with our solar for the last 3 years. This was just loved by, it didn't matter where you sat on that segmentation, and we were kind of recruiting people who were concerned, cautious, disengaged and doubtful on climate change. So we're using that segmentation to really focus who we were recruiting in groups. People loved it, not because we love footy, but we also love it as a girl footy player, and there's a lot of Melburnians. Wonderful what women are doing in the area of football. It's got a sense of community benefit, of something that was happening now rather than something that could happen in the future, and this notion of kind of local and national pride involved in having renewable energy, and so it worked extremely well. In the testing that we did, we talked broadly about how people felt about climate change during a time of COVID. And here are some of the quotes. And again, from a pretty, we excluded anybody who said that climate change was one of the top issues that concerned them when they voted. And we always exclude deniers from these conversations because they're impossible to engage in conversation. They completely derail the conversation. But we did have people who were quite doubtful about climate change. And there was this real sense of, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. And so these are some of the quotes that you might want to read that we got from that group. And that's really made us, one of the things that has been very interesting to me, and I'll finish in a minute because there's time for questions. When COVID hit, and I, do different things with meet different people and engage in different parts engage in different sectors, I was pretty impressed about the extent to which the environment movement, so COVID made a lot of people go, oh God, we've just got to stop and rethink what we're doing. And it caught a lot of people kind of rabbit in the headlights feeling. But the climate movement, which is very good, they probably took about 24 hours to think, okay, we're going to do things differently, and then just surged ahead. I think there's something about having been involved in climate change for a long time, which is not me, but a lot of the people I work with, that makes people realise that we are going to have, the climate crisis is going to be intertwined and interconnected to a whole range of other crises that we may or may not be able to predict, whether they are economic, whether they're health, whether they're social. And the idea that we have to only deal with one at one time, or with one new crisis knocks off this other crisis, isn't kind of, as somebody said here, we haven't got the luxury of choosing. And it's really people in the climate movement that have their kind of, you know, decision to continue to forge ahead, obviously under a different context, that have really made me, kind of kept me really optimistic during what's been an extremely challenging year. And I haven't even been in Melbourne, so my thoughts always to Melbourne people. Right, that's it. I think we need to stop. There's you know, if you're interested in this whole notion of, if you're a communicator, if you have or haven't read my book, the final chapter is, you know, tips on how in your own personal life or in the work that you do, how do we break the climate science? And so there's a few tips. I'm happy to delve into that when we get into questions, but we should get into questions, shouldn't we, Liz?
Yes, thanks, Rebecca. That was great. I'll pick a few that are relevant to the segmentation to start with. So one question is, when 4% of disengaged, 16% of doubtful and 9% dismissive add up, it will potentially reverse or jeopardise the progress of addressing climate change.
That's exactly right.
What can we do to educate and convince them? And you just gave us some tips then, but could you talk a little bit more about your thoughts on what?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's right. And I think that when the cumulative effect of all of those three is a problem, it slows things down. So I still believe that unless a dismissive, that the percentage of dismissives in the community is probably going to be extremely hard to shift because of the nature. Like I kind of expect, and will not be dismayed, is if every time we do the segmentation, the dismissive group is, you know, 5 to 9%. I actually don't really care, right? Unless they're in Parliament or unless they have a platform that amplifies their views and makes everybody else think that they're actually a bigger part of the community than not. Which is why I say you can ignore a dismissive at the dinner table at Christmas, but you can't ignore Tony Abbott in Parliament. So if you want to have an argument, if you want to do something about the dismissive category, you target them in positions of power where the dismissive line is amplified, right? So that's what you do there. But I don't really expect much to happen there. The doubtful category is really important, really important. We want to start to whittle that down. And if we could get that to single digits, that would be great as well. This is why, and to go back to that testing that we did with the power plan, this is why talking about renewables and disconnecting renewables from climate action, at least in the initial stage, is really critical for this group. Because when we look at the segmentation, I'll show you this detail, is that doubtful people aren't opposed to renewable energy. They want government investment in renewable energy. They see the climate, you know, see climate solutions very much in terms of not international responsibilities, but current, local, relevant, national, local community benefit. So we do really have to target this group. We have to make the doubtful people, they can stay doubtful about the climate science, but we want them confident about the climate solutions. And so, this segmentation has meant that a lot of groups are starting to think about how do we reach out to this group, and what do we do? The disengaged, this is very tricky. And again, I don't quite know what we do about this. The disengaged are, of all the groups, the one where it's most clearly gender is an issue here. They are 70% women between the ages of about 30 and mid-50s doing part-time work. For anybody who does any gender work whatsoever, you know what these women's lives are like, right? They're looking after kids, they're caring for older people, they're on very restricted incomes. And I've done groups with women like this. When you talk to them about climate change, particularly if you talk about why aren't you engaged and why aren't you doing more, they're like, I'm just trying to get to Friday and find the other shoe. Right? These are women who are not well supported by in a whole range of ways. climate change feels like just such a, I mean, it's an overwhelming issue for everybody. For this group, it's a hugely overwhelming issue. They're not just disengaged from climate, they're disengaged from politics. And so it may be that they are, and their media is almost completely stripped of any kind of political relevance. So, I mean, I don't know what we do about this group, but we do have to find a way, in other ways, to make them feel more supported, to make them feel like climate solutions are going to make their lives today better. So again, it's a very tricky group to reach and a very tricky group for different reasons than dismissives. So, and educating and convincing a group of people who are already so under the pump and so overwhelmed is really hard. There are softer ways to do it through the media they consume, through other kinds of messages. They're not going to join climate action groups. They potentially could get engaged in these issues through school groups, through, the move to put more solar energy into schools, which might benefit that school or whatever, whatever that is. Our challenge at the moment is thinking about that doubtful group, because 16% is not insignificant. And we may find it difficult to convince them entirely on the climate science, but we can convince them that the climate solutions are real, relevant to them, beneficial to them, their communities and the nation. So that's what we have to do. We have to do it with quite specific messengers as well, like not climate scientists or progressive politicians, a very particular strategy for talking to this group. And the great thing about segmentation is it's trying to get people looking at that 16% and thinking, okay, how can we whittle that down? I hope I've answered that question, anonymous attendee.
That's great. There's a question from Anna about the cautious group in particular.
Yeah.
She's Doctors for the Environment. She's
Yes.
wanting to know if you can talk about the effectiveness of health messages, both benefits and harms with the cautious.
Yeah, great question. So I find, in the quality of research that I do, I've always found really interesting outcomes from very open questions rather than closed questions. So one of the big questions I ask people is, can we think about all the good things when we have a healthy environment, whatever that looks like, what are the biggest benefits to us from a healthy environment? And I find that in these kinds of cautious or, mildly concerned groups, health is always one of the first things that they identify. In a good way, it's not just health like less asthma, but it's also mental health and community health. People realise, and in fact, I think this is the thing that COVID has helped kind of focus on. Think about what our lives would be like under lockdown if we didn't have green space to walk in. All right? Think about what our lives would be like in lockdown during fires as well, which is almost more terrifying. Thank God we're not headed for quite the horrible, hopefully, knock on wood, horrible fire season that we had last year. So health is incredibly effective, but I would also really encourage is to have a broader frame around health, mental health, social health, as well as physical health. There's been quite a bit of, and so trying to, I noticed in the Fight for Planet A, which I'm sure a lot of people saw, there was a quite effective sequence there where they kind of went to the Hunter Valley and talked about some of these open cut mines and the effect that it's having on local people in terms of increased childhood asthma and all of those kinds of challenges. So those are huge. I think people really do understand some of the impacts of particularly coal seam gas on things like water security and food security as well. So yeah, we absolutely need to begin to emphasise that. Terrific to have healthcare professionals of different kinds, whether that be everything from doctors to midwives to nurses to psychologists. And in fact, we've seen those professions, as you would know, Anna, do some incredible things, kind of coming together to do some terrific things, whether that be advocacy, whether that be guides for communication, whether that be support or specifically creating niches within those healthcare professions to deal specifically with either climate advocacy or climate effects. So that health frame is really terrific. I'm looking to do some more work around that with some climate researchers who are particularly interested in the connection between health and climate change.
Building on the COVID and health piece, what are your thoughts on making a strong link between COVID and taking action on to keep us safe during COVID and taking action on climate change? Do you feel like that's too murky a link, or is that a link that's actually really resonating with people at the moment?
Yeah, so I think there's a immediate opportunity and there's a kind of longer term opportunity that predates COVID and will be a harder nut to crack. The immediate opportunity is that going into research, when COVID hit, my immediate concern was, oh my God, what's going to happen is that people are going to work from home, they'll be commuting less. There was a whole lot of stuff on social media about nature bouncing back because of COVID and, you know, all the animals returning to things and the air being clean. I mean, it's a bit of a furphy. There'll be a slight decrease in emissions. People will notice things around them, but in no way is this going to be a reprieve. It's not a kind of a free pass. But anyway, my concern was that I thought, oh my God, people are going to associate significant, you know, economic and social disruption and personal stress and anxiety with environmental benefit. They're going to go, the air is clearer and the animals are coming back to where they were before, but I have to homeschool my children for 2 months for that to happen. Screw that. No way, you know. So I think, and I could have I can't have a beer at the pub, you know, so that plays, I was really worried, that plays absolutely into the kind of tool kit of the deniers who say that what we want is for everybody to be wearing burlap sacks, you know, shivering in cages and, you know, eating vegan burgers for the rest of our lives. So I was really worried about that. But actually there was no indication that that happened, in Australia at least. In all the qual, people were saying, look, obviously we don't want to live like this, but we realise that with some behaviour change that we already quite like maybe commuting less and working home for more and all of that kinds of stuff, and that we actually can get some, we can actually return to a reasonable economy with some environmental benefit. And then I said, you know, we've had to change, and it shows that we can change if we're told to change, and there's this kind of, you know, bipartisan support for change. So actually, and I was so happy about this. It actually gave people a bit of confidence that with the right leadership, we can change quickly in a way that benefits the environment as well as keeps our economy basically ticking over. The other thing I would say broadly is that, and this is the work specifically I've done around jobs, economic recovery, climate and COVID, is we have long way to go, as the Climate of the Nation research has shown, to convince people that the fossil fuel industry doesn't employ millions of Australians. And consistently, people overestimate how many people it employs and how much wealth it creates, compared to, for example, the university sector, which would employ, the tertiary education sector would employ vastly more people than the fossil fuel industry, is potentially a far more important creator of wealth through innovation, through the service that it provides. Just doesn't have that social, cultural frame of, you know, we employ people, we're central to Australia's national identity and jobs. So in order for us, we have to demolish that, and really, when the numbers are on our side. Then we have to build this idea that a renewable energy powered economy can generate lots of different kinds of jobs for different kinds of Australians in different parts of Australia. So that's another challenge, to say a renewable energy powered economy is not just a whole lot of people installing solar panels. But what does that look like? And that work is being done. It's probably should have been done 10 years ago, but who cares? It's slowly being done, and you'll see more stuff happen there. So once people realise, okay, where is our economy going? Where is the opportunity? Where's our competitive opportunity? Where are the jobs for the future? And where is the investment money going? Where is the business community outside the fossil fuel industry slowly turning its head to? It's in renewable energy, and we better take this opportunity. So there's a lot of we have to step through. But the people are open to that, right? So what I found in the qual and the quant is they want to be convinced that that's possible. But we've still got a lot of ducks in a row we have to do to really genuinely convince people.
And Rebecca, there are a couple of questions too around, are we seeing differences in certain electoral geographies?
Yeah, absolutely.
Professions and things like that. So comments that say, oh, I'm seeing psychological differences between the splits that have been made, but what patterns are we seeing geographically or sector-wise?
Yeah, so I think that the most powerful combination in terms of the segmentation, other than politics is still really important because this issue has been so politicised in Australia and America, and it's become a political left-right issue in the way it isn't in the Philippines or Fiji or even bizarrely in the UK. Right? We can't just blame the Murdoch press, although we can blame them for a bit. So politics is important. The two biggest things that I would identify in politics are location and education. Right? So education is becoming so important. The interaction between education and politics is becoming so important, not income. People think, oh, you know, wealthy people care about climate, and it's not true. I mean, you know, Donald Trump's pretty wealthy. Well, it's not actually about income. It's about education, because a whole lot of social, cultural and political things can flow from education and location. There is a rural, regional, city skew to every one of those segmentations, and there's probably an inner city, outer city, you know, suburban skew as well. Increasingly, there's an interesting, you know, I am never one, and I always react to people generalising about regional Australia. You know, the seat of Indi is in regional Australia, of Mayo is in regional Australia. You know, all of those seats that went from the Nationals to the Greens in the north coast of New South Wales are regional. So there's different kinds of regional Australia. So it's that combination of location and education and politics that is really the thing that's driving these differences. There are occasionally, I mean, overall, there are generational differences, but not as pronounced as those other ones, and a little bit of gender differences, but really the most marked one is in that disengaged group. And that's not about women caring less about climate, that's women having more caring responsibilities and less economic power in our society. That's what that's about.
Yeah.
So what that means, what does that mean? What that means is that our focus, and particularly my focus consistently in the qualitative research, is to look at those elements when I'm recruiting. So consistently, I tend to focus on regional and outer metropolitan city areas, particularly the suburbs, because while people keep talking about coal seats versus inner city seats, the vast majority of seats and the growth in seats at the federal level will be in outer metropolitan, suburban Australia. Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane. So I look at those seats and then I look at education. And increasingly, if I really want to understand the mindset of who we have to persuade, I'm actively excluding anybody with postgraduate education, and then looking at a mixture of different, you know, people that haven't gone to university, people who've gone to university late in life, TAFE and undergrad. The other, of course, interesting, and it's not numerically important, but it's strategically really important, is what we're calling teal conservatives. So kind of Malcolm Turnbull, Zali Steggall conservatives who are never going to vote for the Labor Party, might vote for the Greens in the upper house. They're just kind of absolutely tearing their hair out about the Conservative position consistently on climate change. And these are the people that in places like New South Wales are, you know, that somebody like Matt Keane the New South Wales Environment Minister, for those of you who aren't New South Wales, who's speaking about climate in the most extraordinary terms. You'd expect him to be a Labor minister, or perhaps he's even doing it. He's fantastic. He's doing terrific stuff, and you're also seeing at a state level. Tasmania has just committed to 200% renewables. South Australia has continued its progression towards renewable energy. So And it's really kind of teal conservatives that delivered the seat for Zali Steggall. And I think you'll start to see more focus in the environment movement more broadly on those conservatives who are like, we do not understand why federally the party has taken the position it has. We're a bit embarrassed about Craig Kelly, and we kind of want to get on with this because we see this as as both an existential threat and a real opportunity to make money.
Mm. And there's a question around positioning of the Green New Deal or a green recovery, Rebecca. When you hear those terms, what groups do they resonate with? Do they resonate with those teal groups? Or?
We deliberately, in the work that we did on this, didn't use green and didn't use New Deal. A renewables-led recovery is the language is very specific. So I've tested the Green New Deal concept in groups before, and it's universally, except for some parts of the Alarm group, not universally rejected, but universally like, why are we using this American concept from the 1930s to describe what we're doing now? So just people don't get it. Even people who like the concept think the language needs to be different. And then people who get the concept get a bit like, why are we, I thought this was just about the transition away from coal and gas and towards renewable. Why are we adding all this other stuff to it? So there's a bit of confusion. And then part of that's a language confusion, but some of it's about a larger problem that we have, which is really a fundamental problem, and I don't have an answer to it, which is for some of those segments, action on climate change is intertwined with, you know, a whole range of social, economic, cultural issues that matter to them. So for me, personally, if the transition to renewable energy is not something that gives greater power, autonomy and opportunity to First Nations groups where these renewable energy projects might be based, that does not sit comfortably with me. But if you're in the cautious or even disengaged group and you're like, what's renewable energy got to do with, you know, Indigenous rights or whatever, and then, you know, you're having a conversation, a confused conversation, it's difficult. So we don't just want, many of us in the progressive movement don't just want a move to renewable energy without some of those other problems addressed, but they're not all going to be addressed towards a transition to renewable energy. So what do we do? And how do we communicate it with people? So whenever I put anything around social justice, just transition, a Green New Deal, any of that stuff, people have sometimes not known what to do. Not always a kind of I'm rejecting this, but a sense of confusion. And I think probably strategically the focus for me is just nailing with people the fact that we can make the transition, that transition is not going to have us all, like I said, shivering in caves where we can only use electricity for an hour. I mean, there's so much that we haven't nailed that trying to find a way to have those other conversations are difficult. So I'm just sort of working out, you know, what is it? How do we do it? Strategically, how do we do it? But like I said, you know, I think that's very hard. That's very hard. So the Green New Deal, whenever I've tested Green New Deal language with concerned and cautious, they're like, what is this? I don't understand. Why is this? What? There's a confusion on an issue that they already find challenging to engage with, so they just shut it down.
Yeah, yeah.
That doesn't mean that we can't, I mean, that being said, when we put it in that language, that's what happened. When we put this idea that greater investment in renewable infrastructure, creating cheaper energy and more jobs could be part of COVID, people got that. But when you talked about a Green New Deal with social justice and workers' rights and, you know, more equality for women and people of colour, people were like, what's this about?
Okay. I'm conscious of time, Rebecca, but before we finish, I'd like to ask a question about your book. So I've been looking through this. It's been a great read. What I found really interesting about it is the fact that you focused on emotions through this book. So somewhat different to the compass that you're showing, which comes across more as being kind of audience segmentation, identity, worldview based.
Although we did do stuff about emotional reaction. I've got this moment where they all map.
Yeah. So was there a link between emotional responses that you touch on in the book and what you saw on the compass?
So what is really interesting is, and again, it goes back to this idea that dismissives or deniers are actually very, very different from the rest of it. When we did an emotion maps, we asked them all these different emotions about how climate change. Deniers are right out on the edge. Everybody else is over here, right out on the edge as bored.
What?
Bored.
Bored.
I'm bored about climate change, which is another way of saying I don't want to engage.
Right, just not there.
It's what my children say to me when I try and talk to them about cleaning the house. That's boring. Right? You just don't want to engage. The most dominant feeling for the alarmed is actually frustration. I mean, there's sadness, there's anger, there's fear, but actually frustration. For them, things aren't moving quickly. Yeah. For most other groups, the top, we gave them lots of different adjectives to choose, are things like confused, uncertain, anxious. It's far less definitive. It's like, I'm concerned, I'm anxious, but I'm uncertain, so I'm uncertain about the way, the political leadership, what's the pathway, I'm anxious, I'm worried. So it's all, it's another word, it's all different words, very, very similar, right? Yeah. And things like sadness, anger, fear, later down the ladder, although with concerned, it's a little bit higher. So quite different emotional responses, but all of them kind of in the same ballpark. It's quite interesting to do the slide. If I ever come back, I'll show it to you. And dismissives are in the corner. It's one of those graphic things when you realise if you are a denier on climate change, you are an outlier. The Murdoch media, the conversation in Parliament might think that you should have skin in the game. You should be part of the conversation. But none of the evidence shows that actually you're even like people who are doubtful or disengaged or cautious. You're actually quite different. And we need to continue to think of them, except if they're in Parliament or positions of power, as capable of being ignored because they're not representative. They can't be convinced, because if they were going to be convinced, they'd be convinced now. The problem is not that they exist. The problem is that they exist in places that make them seem more important and significant than they already are. So remember them out on the corner, and that's where we want people to understand where they actually are, which is bored. They are bored. They say they are bored about climate change, which is basically they don't want to talk about it.
And for everyone else, it sounds like messages of love and hope really resonate. So if we start playing more in that space, we're the potential to group those things together.
We've run out of time and lots of great questions. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rebecca Huntley. It's been lovely to chat. For everyone, please take a read of Rebecca's book. You can subscribe to MSSI's newsletter. It's being shared in the chat right now, and we look forward to keeping you up to date with future events. Thanks again, Rebecca.
And cross fingers for a good election result.
We'll see. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.